The sound of retreat. The morning sun cast long shadows across the battlefield as Captain Elena Rodriguez gripped her rifle tighter. The radio crackled with urgent voices from command headquarters, each transmission more desperate than the last. Around her, soldiers were already beginning to fall back, their faces etched with exhaustion and defeat. Elena had been fighting for 3 days straight without proper rest. Her unit had been tasked with holding a strategic mountain pass that controlled access to 3 villages below. The enemy forces had proven far more numerous than intelligence had suggested. What was supposed to be a routine defensive operation had turned into a nightmare of constant artillery bombardment and wave after wave of advancing troops. The radio in her hand buzzed again. This time it was Colonel Martinez himself, speaking directly to all unit commanders in the sector. His voice was strained but clear. "All units, this is command. Execute immediate tactical withdrawal to secondary positions. Repeat, all units fall back to secondary defensive lines. This is not a suggestion, this is a direct order." Elena looked around at her remaining soldiers. Out of the 40 men and women who had started this mission with her, only 18 remained combat effective. The others were either wounded, dead, or had been evacuated during brief lulls in the fighting. Her sergeant, Miguel Santos, approached with a grim expression. "Captain, the men are ready to move out. We can be at the secondary line in 20 minutes if we leave now," Santos reported, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of incoming artillery. But Elena was studying something through her binoculars that made her pause. In the valley below, she could see 2 separate command posts flying different colored flags. Her military training had taught her to recognize enemy leadership structures, and what she was seeing made her heart race with possibility. The first command post, marked with red banners, appeared to house General Vasquez, the regional commander whose tactical brilliance had been causing problems for her country's forces for months. Intelligence reports had placed him somewhere in this area, but his exact location had been unknown until now. The second position, about 800 meters to the east and marked with blue flags, seemed to be the operational headquarters for General Torres. This man was responsible for the supply lines that kept enemy forces in this entire sector fed and armed. Taking out either of these targets would be significant, but both together could change the entire dynamic of the regional conflict. Elena made a decision that would either make her a hero or result in a court-martial. She turned to Santos and spoke quietly, knowing that what she was about to propose went against every military protocol they had learned. "Miguel, I need you to take 15 of our people and start the withdrawal as ordered. Make sure everyone knows you're following my direct instructions. Get them to safety and tell command that Captain Rodriguez is conducting a final reconnaissance before falling back." Santos looked confused and concerned. "Captain, what are you planning?" "Those are direct orders from Colonel Martinez. We need to move now, or we'll be cut off completely." Elena handed him her personal radio and pointed toward the valley. "Look through these binoculars and tell me what you see down there." Santos took the field glasses and studied the enemy positions for a long moment. When he lowered them, his expression had changed completely. "Those are command posts, high-value targets. But, Captain, there's no way a force our size could take both positions and survive. We'd need air support, artillery, at least a full company of soldiers." "Not if we're smart about it," Elena replied, her mind already working through the tactical possibilities. "I'm taking 2 volunteers with the best marksmanship skills we have. We're going to move down through the eastern ravine while the enemy thinks we're all retreating. They'll be focused on our withdrawal, not watching for a small team moving in the opposite direction." The plan was dangerous to the point of being suicidal, but Elena could see the strategic value. The enemy commanders had positioned themselves to oversee what they expected to be their final push against the retreating forces. They would be vulnerable for perhaps 30 minutes while they coordinated the pursuit. It was a narrow window, but it might be enough. Santos shook his head. "Captain, This is madness. Even if you somehow manage to take out both generals, you'll never make it back alive. The entire enemy force will converge on your position. Elena had already identified the two soldiers she wanted for this mission. Corporal Ana Fuentes was their best sniper, capable of accurate shots at distances that seemed impossible. Private Carlos Mendez was an explosives expert who could create diversions and clear obstacles under pressure. "Miguel, sometimes a small action at the right moment can change everything," Elena said, checking her weapons one final time. "Those two generals down there are coordinating the entire enemy offensive in this region. Remove them, and their forces will be confused and leaderless for hours, maybe days. That could give our main force the time they need to regroup and launch a proper counterattack." As Santos reluctantly gathered the rest of the unit to begin their withdrawal, Elena approached Fuentes and Mendez. Both soldiers were exhausted, but when she explained the situation, their eyes lit up with the same dangerous determination she was feeling. "It's a volunteer mission only," she told them clearly. "What we're about to attempt has never been tried before, and honestly, our chances of survival are not good. If either of you wants to go with Santos and the others, I completely understand." Corporal Fuentes shouldered her sniper rifle and checked her ammunition supply. "Captain, I've been watching those command posts through my scope for the last hour. I can make the shots, but we'll need perfect timing and a lot of luck." Private Mendez was already calculating distances and angles for his explosive charges. "I can create enough chaos to cover our approach and extraction, but we'll have maybe 10 minutes before they organize a proper response." Elena felt a mixture of pride and fear as she looked at these two soldiers who were willing to follow her into what could very well be their final battle. The sound of her unit's withdrawal was growing fainter as Santos led them towards safety, leaving just the three of them to attempt something that military textbooks would probably classify as impossible. The enemy artillery had temporarily stopped, creating an eerie quiet across the battlefield. Elena knew this was likely because the enemy commanders were coordinating their next move, which made it the perfect time for her small team to begin their descent into the valley. As they moved carefully down the rocky slope, Elena couldn't help but think about the radio message she had ignored. Colonel Martinez would be furious when he learned what she had done, assuming she lived long enough to face his anger. But sometimes, she thought, the difference between victory and defeat came down to a single soldier's willingness to take an impossible risk at exactly the right moment. Into the Valley of Shadows, Elena and her two companions moved like ghosts through the rocky terrain, using every boulder and crevice for cover as they descended toward the enemy positions. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows, which would help conceal their approach, but also meant they had less time before darkness made precise targeting impossible. Corporal Fuentes had identified the optimal shooting position about 400 meters from the first command post. From there, she would have clear lines of sight to both target areas while remaining hidden behind a cluster of large rocks. The challenge was reaching that position without being detected by the dozens of enemy sentries posted throughout the valley. Elena led the way, using hand signals to communicate with her team. Her military training had included extensive work in stealth operations, but this was the first time she had attempted to penetrate so deeply into enemy-controlled territory with such a small force. Every step had to be calculated, every movement planned to avoid detection. The first obstacle appeared when they were halfway down the slope. A patrol of 6 enemy soldiers was moving directly toward their position, apparently conducting a routine security sweep of the area. Elena signaled for her team to freeze and take cover behind a fallen tree that provided just enough concealment. The patrol passed within 15 meters of their hiding spot, close enough that Elena could hear the soldiers talking quietly among themselves. They were discussing the expected pursuit of the retreating forces, completely unaware that 3 enemy soldiers were lying motionless just meters away. Once the patrol had moved past, Elena led her team further down into the valley, constantly adjusting their route to avoid additional enemy positions. Private Mendez was carrying enough explosive charges to create significant diversions, but using them too early would alert every enemy soldier in the area to their presence. As they approached the shooting position Fuentes had identified, Elena could see both enemy command posts clearly for the first time. The red-flagged position housing General Vasquez was a cluster of military vehicles and communication equipment surrounded by at least 30 soldiers. The blue-flagged headquarters of General Torres was similarly protected, with multiple layers of defensive positions. Elena realized that their original plan would need modification. Taking out both generals simultaneously would require perfect coordination and split-second timing. She gathered her team behind the rock formation and whispered her new strategy. "Ana, you'll have approximately 30 seconds to take both shots before they locate your position. Carlos, you'll need to create 2 separate diversions, one to draw attention away from Ana's location and another to cover our escape route. The timing has to be absolutely perfect." Fuentes was studying both targets through her scope, calculating wind direction, distance, and the movement patterns of the enemy commanders. "I can see both generals clearly from here. General Vasquez is standing near a communication trailer, relatively stationary. General Torres moves around more, but there's a pattern to his movements. Every few minutes he stops at a map table for about 20 seconds. Mendez had been examining the terrain and enemy positions, planning his explosive diversions. "I can plant charges in 2 locations that will create maximum confusion. The first will simulate an artillery strike about 200 meters north of here, which should draw security forces away from both command posts. The second charge can create an apparent attack from the eastern ridge, giving us a clear escape route to the west." Elena checked her watch. They had been moving for almost an hour, and the enemy pursuit of her retreating unit would begin soon. Once that started, the valley would be flooded with additional troops, making escape nearly impossible. "We execute in 10 minutes, she decided. "Carlos, you move out now and get your charges in position. Ana, start tracking your targets and identify the optimal moment for your shots. I'll provide security and coordinate the timing." Mendez moved out silently, carrying his explosive charges toward the predetermined positions. Elena watched him disappear into the rocky terrain, impressed by his ability to move without making a sound despite the weight of his equipment. Fuentes had settled into her shooting position and was making final adjustments to her rifle. Through her scope, she could see General Vasquez clearly as he moved between vehicles at his command post. General Torres was more challenging, frequently moving in and out of view as he consulted with his staff. Elena positioned herself where she could observe both enemy headquarters while maintaining communication with her sniper. The tension was building as they waited for Mendez to complete his preparations and signal that he was ready. Suddenly, an unexpected complication arose. A large group of enemy reinforcements began moving through the valley, apparently heading toward the positions recently abandoned by Elena's unit. Their route would take them directly between the 2 command posts, potentially blocking Fuentes' line of sight at the critical moment. Elena had to make another split-second decision. They could wait for the reinforcements to pass, but that might mean losing their opportunity entirely. Alternatively, they could proceed with the mission despite the additional troops, but that would significantly increase the risk of detection and pursuit. Through her binoculars, Elena could see that both enemy generals had emerged from their command vehicles to observe the movement of their reinforcements. This actually presented a better opportunity than they had originally hoped for, as both targets were now clearly visible and relatively stationary. Elena made her decision and signaled to Fuentes to prepare for immediate action. The corporal acknowledged with a slight nod and began tracking her first target through her scope. The crosshairs settled on General Vasquez as he stood conferring with his staff near the communication trailer. Mendez's voice came through Elena's earpiece in a barely audible whisper. "Charges set and ready, waiting for your signal." Elena could feel her heart pounding as she prepared to give the order that would either succeed beyond their wildest hopes or result in their immediate death. The enemy reinforcements were now positioned directly between their hiding spot and both command posts, but this also meant that the confusion following the attack would be even greater. "Execute in 30 seconds," Elena whispered into her radio. "Anna, take your first shot immediately after the northern diversion. Carlos, trigger the eastern diversion 15 seconds later to cover our withdrawal." Fuentes had General Vasquez centered in her crosshairs and was controlling her breathing to ensure accuracy. General Torres had stopped at his map table, presenting the second target she would need to engage within seconds of the first shot. Elena began the countdown that would determine whether their impossible mission would become a legendary success or a noble failure. Around them, the enemy valley buzzed with activity as hundreds of soldiers prepared for what they thought would be a routine pursuit of defeated opponents, completely unaware that 3 determined fighters were about to change the entire course of the battle. The moment of truth was approaching, and there would be no opportunity for hesitation or second thoughts. Everything they had trained for, everything they believed in, was about to be tested in the next few minutes of intense combat. The shot that changed everything. Elena's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Execute now!" The first explosion erupted 200 meters to the north, sending a massive column of smoke and debris into the air. Enemy soldiers immediately began shouting and running toward the apparent artillery strike, exactly as Mendez had planned. In the confusion, dozens of troops moved away from both command posts, leaving the generals more exposed than they had been all day. Corporal Fuentes squeezed her trigger with the precision that had made her the unit's best marksman. The bullet traveled across the valley in less than a second, striking General Vasquez in the center of his chest as he turned toward the explosion. He collapsed instantly, causing immediate chaos among his command staff. Without hesitation, Fuentes shifted her aim to the second target. General Torres had moved away from his map table when the first explosion occurred, but the confusion had caused him to stop in an even more exposed position. Fuentes tracked him through her scope, compensated for the slight crosswind, and fired her second shot. General Torres fell beside his communication equipment, and the entire enemy operation suddenly lost its coordination. Officers at both command posts began shouting conflicting orders as they tried to understand what was happening and who was now in command. Elena was already moving before the second shot was fired. "Displacement now," she ordered through her radio. "Carlos, eastern diversion in 10 seconds." Mendez triggered his second explosive charge right on schedule, creating the appearance of an attack from the eastern ridge. This sent even more enemy soldiers running in the wrong direction, further away from Elena's team as they began their escape through the western part of the valley. The 3 soldiers moved with desperate speed through the rocky terrain, knowing that once the enemy realized what had actually happened, every available soldier would be hunting for them. Behind them, the valley was filled with the sounds of confusion and conflicting orders as enemy officers tried to regain control of their forces. Elena led her team up a steep ravine that would take them toward friendly territory, but they had to cover almost 3 kilometers of enemy-controlled ground before reaching safety. The terrain was rough and provided good concealment, but it also slowed their movement significantly. After 10 minutes of hard climbing, they could hear the sounds of organized pursuit beginning behind them. Enemy officers had finally realized that the explosions were diversions and that their commanding generals had been killed by sniper fire. Search teams were being organized and would soon be combing every possible escape route. Fuentes was breathing heavily from the exertion of carrying her heavy sniper rifle up the rocky slope. "Captain, they're going to have tracking dogs and aerial reconnaissance looking for us within the hour. We need to find a place to lay low until dark." Elena had been thinking the same thing. Moving during daylight was becoming increasingly dangerous, but they also needed to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the enemy search teams. She decided on a compromise that might give them the best chance of survival. "There's a network of caves about 2 kilometers ahead," she told her team. "If we can reach them before the search intensifies, we can wait there until nightfall and then make our final push to friendly lines." They continued climbing through increasingly difficult terrain, using every available piece of cover to avoid detection from above. The sound of helicopter rotors was growing closer, indicating that aerial searches had indeed begun. Mendez suddenly grabbed Elena's arm and pointed toward the sky. A military helicopter was approaching their general area, flying in a search pattern that would bring it directly over their position within minutes. The 3 soldiers quickly took cover under a rock overhang and remained perfectly still as the aircraft passed overhead. The helicopter hovered nearby for several minutes, its crew obviously searching for any sign of the team responsible for killing the 2 generals. Elena could see soldiers rappelling from the aircraft to begin a ground search of the area they had just vacated. When the helicopter finally moved on to search other areas, Elena's team continued their desperate climb toward the cave system. They were exhausted, low on ammunition, and being hunted by hundreds of enemy soldiers. But they had accomplished something that military analysts would later describe as strategically impossible. The caves they were seeking turned out to be a complex network of natural formations that provided excellent concealment. Elena chose a position deep enough to avoid detection, but close enough to the entrance to allow quick escape if necessary. They would wait here for 6 hours until darkness provided cover for their final escape. As they settled in to wait, Elena finally had time to consider what they had accomplished. The elimination of both enemy generals would create confusion in command structures that could last for days or weeks. Without clear leadership, the enemy offensive that had been pushing her country's forces back would likely stall completely. Fuentes was cleaning her rifle and inventorying her remaining ammunition. "Captain, do you think anyone will believe what we just did? Taking out 2 enemy generals with a 3-person team while disobeying direct orders to retreat?" Elena smiled for the first time in days. "Anna, I'm not sure I believe it myself, and I was there. But the important thing is that those enemy forces down there are now leaderless and confused. Our main forces will have time to regroup and plan a proper counteroffensive." As darkness began to fall, the 3 soldiers prepared for their final push toward friendly territory. They had completed a mission that would be studied in military academies for generations to come, proving that sometimes individual initiative and courage could change the course of entire battles. The journey back to their own lines took 4 hours of careful movement through enemy territory, but they encountered no further opposition. Most enemy forces were still searching for them in the wrong areas or trying to establish new command structures to replace their fallen generals. When Elena, Fuentes, and Mendez finally reached friendly territory, they were greeted by Colonel Martinez himself, who had been monitoring radio traffic about the enemy confusion. His anger at Elena's disobedience of direct orders was tempered by amazement at what her small team had accomplished. "Captain Rodriguez," the colonel said, "you realize that what you did was completely against military protocol and could result in serious disciplinary action." Elena stood at attention, ready to accept whatever consequences her actions had earned. "Yes, sir. I take full responsibility for the decision to ignore the retreat order and engage enemy command positions." Colonel Martinez studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "Captain, you and your team have just accomplished something that our intelligence services said was impossible. The enemy offensive in this entire sector has collapsed due to leadership confusion. Our forces are already beginning to advance and retake territory we lost over the past month." The official recognition came later, but Elena knew that the real victory was in the lives saved by stopping the enemy advance. Sometimes, she had learned, the most important decisions were made not by high-ranking officers in comfortable headquarters, but by individual soldiers willing to take impossible risks at critical moments. Her decision to ignore the retreat order and attack two heavily defended enemy positions with only two companions had changed the entire strategic situation in the region. Military historians would later write that the Battle of Twin Generals marked the turning point in the conflict, initiated by three soldiers who refused to retreat when victory seemed impossible.